what we've started to see on the back end of that, or the result of that, kind of the backlash, I guess, if you will, is that there's also decreased production. So people are buying less coal. So this is a diagram, again, from the EIA, the Energy Information Administration governmental group. And this shows U.S. coal production per year from 2008, all the way on the left side of the graph, down to 2018, and then projected into 2020. So notice that there's actually a fairly consistent decline with a couple of like jumps and blips. The biggest one being 2016, right? We see this massive decrease, slight increase, and then decreases going forward. The red is showing what's actually projected for the future. So again, when we look at the data, right? When we look at actually what happens when the rubber meets the road, we start to be able to kind of transcend politics, right? I mean, that's the goal of science, right? Is to kind of avoid all of the conversation, the argument, and look at what are the trends, like what is the reality. And the reality is coal's on its way out, right? Being a coal miner is not a job for the 21st century, right? That's a pretty goofy way to think about things. I guess you could say that a shifting energy environment is really kind of what we're in the middle of right now. And so we're transitioning, we're kind of weaning ourselves off of coal, in a sense, for a variety of reasons, both financial and economic or ecological. So it's not really just one group running the show. And we're replacing that with other sources of power, again, for both financial and ecological reasons. So this is actually a great graphic I stumbled across recently. Again, this is derived from EIA data, so it's all government public access data. And this is what we're going to see 2015 to 2023. So this data was first published a little while ago. We're kind of in the middle of this now. And so what it shows on the left in the gray is those are megawatts being retired. So that's energy that's that's no longer going to be online. And in most cases you don't see the label, but if you look carefully on the red side, it labels what each energy type is. And so the uppermost bar is natural gas. And so we notice that some portion of megawatts of natural gas are planning to be retired. Oftentimes that has to do with the age of the facility or the infrastructure, right? So if there's a natural gas power plant that's been operating for 30 years, it's probably run its course and it's cheaper to replace it with a new facility. If you look down at wind, again, 0.2% solar, none scheduled to be retired in that amount of time. Nuclear, 1.6%, rolling off of the energy books, if you will. Other, which could be geothermal and some other types of solar, which are not counted, and tidal power and all sorts of interesting things like that. Really in the minutia, the weird wild stuff, biomass and things like that. You can see other, about 6.3% rolling off the books. But staggering, right? When we look at this bottom line, that's coal. Coal is scheduled to be rolling off the books. So total megawatts retired, you can look at this, just about 40,000 megawatts are going to be retired off of the grid in the next few years, right? In the next 5, 6, 7 years. So of the stuff that's being retired, most of it is coal, because we're done with coal, right? It doesn't work that well. And actually, I should back off. I shouldn't say that we're done with coal, but coal's role is going to be dramatically reduced going forward. It has too many problems. It's pretty intensive environmentally and pretty intensive cost-wise, right? It's much easier to take gas or something and put it in a pipe and take it where you need to go. So if we look on the other side of this chart, so the new megawatts being added to our national grid, we're outpacing coal. We're outpacing the energy taken off, so about 70,000 megawatts added. Natural gas leading the way, right? Most new power that's going to be generated is generated from natural gas, which really is our some content we're going to dive into here in the future. Wind. So wind is fairly cheap, right? It's not too much money to put up a wind turbine. Steel, right? You got to pay for steel depending on the state of tariffs and things like that, or if it's U.S. steel, if it's produced locally. Solar. Again, there's a couple of different types of solar, but you can see that that's a technology that's becoming more and more and more accessible. 15 years ago, it was pretty financially difficult to install solar panels on a personal home. Now it's much easier to do that. Nuclear, again, nuclear has a PR issue, but really it's a pretty good band-aid, right? It has some significant downsides, which we're going to discuss at a later time in the semester. But the upside is it doesn't really produce CO2, and the amount of waste that it produces is a fairly small volume. And then also, like I said, coal is not completely written off. There are some new coal power plants planned, but again, those are really in the minority. Fun with maps, right? Those of you interested in GIS or geospatial careers, there's tons of money in it. If you want to know more about a GIS or a geospatial career, shoot me an email. But this is just a graphical or a map version of the same data that we were looking at, although in the last diagram, although that data didn't have any location. So here in this first map, you can actually see coal power plants that are going to be retired, or ones that have been retired, and ones that are set for future retirement. And the diameter of the circle of each of these is basically the size of that coal power plant. How many megawatts does it generate? And you can see there's a little key over on the bottom right, 1,000, 2,000, and 3,000. When you look at this map, there's a couple of things that you see, right? So again, we see 3 different color codes on the bottom, and then our size. And there's a lot of gray dots on this diagram, but there's a lot of orange dots, and there's a lot of red dots as well. It's kind of a shotgun blast. And as is generally true, we see the majority of these dots over in the East Coast, and particularly down south. Well, there's a lot of people who live there, but also that's not too far from coal country, right? Makes perfect sense. So looking at those dots, you can see that red, those are keyed to coal-fired power plants that have actually been retired recently, so those are recently pulled offline. Orange dots are those that are scheduled to be pulled offline by 2023. So again, we're shutting these things down every year. Every year there are new coal plants that are shutting down, and famously in the news last year, Westmoreland, which is our 6th largest coal company in the United States, filed for bankruptcy in October 2018. Right, so they're on the ropes, as it were. So in the next graph, this is added power. So again, this is just a representation of the material that we saw in the previous graph. So again, if we look at how these are keyed, we've got coal, which is kind of this gray color, natural gas as a blue, nuclear, wind, solar, and other, in this case, looking at where it is, likely hydroelectric. So some of the themes that you can come away with this graph from, which is new power capacity 2015 to 2023, there are just a few new coal power plants planned. It looks like we've got some down here in the southeast, a couple in Wyoming, which makes sense, right? If you're generating that material there, you may as well burn it there and put that out on the power grid, and one in California. But that's the minority, right? So we see lots of natural gas being added. So blue dots all over this thing, kind of general blue, not the light, not the kind of sky blue, so the kind of regular blue. That's all over the place. Those are new natural gas plants, and again, cheaper, more efficient, doesn't require as many workers, less waste produced, and also less CO2 in the atmosphere. But the price we have to pay is extraction of natural gas. So some other things that are notable to point out here is that wind power, we see some big ones here in the Central Plains area, just where we expect that to happen, right? Because there's a lot of wind source there. If you've driven from Boise to Twin Falls lately, you've driven past lots of new wind power that has been installed out there. Also, as you're driving out to Oregon or out to Portland or something like that, you drive past miles of these wind turbines. Nuclear, again, you can see a few new ones down south. One of the issues with nuclear is that a lot of the nuclear technology that people really freak out about, like the Fukushima stuff, is Fukushima was built in 1960, right? That's almost a 70-year-old facility, which is pretty crazy if you think about it. Every 70-year-old facility should be retired and replaced with something modern. So modern nuclear is much different than like the typical 1960s, 1970s light water reactors that we've put in all over the planet. But new nuclear technology is pretty solid. And then we see other shown in green, and kind of looking where it is in this case, or looking where they are. There's a few of them scattered around, likely hydroelectric, but it doesn't specify. So those are places where we have major rivers. And so what I want to leave off this segment with is this graph that shows CO2 released per kilogram of material. So you've seen this before, but I just wanted to kind of loop back and touch on this. And so one of the reasons why we're moving away from coal and moving to these other resources is the CO2 that's produced. But again, that's not necessarily the problem with coal, right? Coal has, well, it is one of the problems with coal, but coal has other problems, right? It's got iron sulfide, so pyrite, which causes sulfur in the atmosphere, sulfur dioxide, which is a greenhouse gas. There's also sulfuric acid that can form when it comes in contact with water. So there are a lot of problems with coal, and those problems that really don't exist with other forms of energy. So again, this is kind of the idea that I like to think of as this is kind of transcendent of politics, right? We can just look at what is the reality of that power source and what is the reality of the future of that power source. So like it or not, coal jobs are not coming back, right? You may see some slight fluctuations, which can be kind of throttled by regulations and things like that. But generally, and even on the global scale, coal is on decline, right? It's had its day in the sun. It just has too many problems and it's too expensive. All right, well, we're gonna get learning about natural gas as our next fossil fuel, and then after that, it's gonna be time for exam number 2. So that will be coming up soon. All right, bye.